Hello all and welcome to RiskOut's webinar BSA 101, covering the basics with United Bankers Bank. We are so excited to have you here joining us today. Now, before we dive into today's webinar content, let's roll through some quick housekeeping items. RiskOut will be sharing all of today's webinar resources, including the slides, handouts, and the recording in a follow-up email, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. Our handouts today include some helpful content, including a SAR narrative best practices walkthrough, an overview of UBB's compliance services, RiskOut's BSA solution one-pager, and a copy of today's slide deck in PDF form that you can follow along with. We also want this session to be as valuable for you as possible, so we encourage you to ask any questions that you may have throughout today's session in the questions section of the webinar panel on the side of your screen. We will also be running a few poll questions throughout today's webinar to better understand who all we have joining us on the call, and your participation is greatly appreciated. So for those of you that are joining us here for the first time, RiskOut is a team of former bank examiners, BSA professionals, and fintech developers helping financial institutions grow and be more efficient and profitable. Through a full BSA AML suite and specialized market tools, RiskOut solutions increase revenue and decrease your compliance burden by unlocking new deposit streams and automating compliance workflows. We are funded and influenced by over 200 financial institutions through networks like Castle Creek, the Bankers Helping Bankers Fund, and Alloy Labs, and we are proud that 100% of our customers are referenceable. If you're interested in learning more about how we help community banks and credit unions every day, visit riskout.com and get in touch. Now, in case you missed it, RiskOut has recently announced a brand new comprehensive BSA AML solution. Our team has been working tirelessly to develop innovative and intuitive ways to solve common industry challenges in the realm of risk scoring, transaction monitoring, onboarding and due diligence, SAR and CTR filing, case and investigation management, and more. And I'm excited that we are officially ready to share our solution with community banks and credit unions. If you would like to join us in taking the BS out of BSA, you can request a demo at riskout.com, or you can answer the demo question in this survey immediately following this very webinar. Now, today's webinar will be led by Kristen Parker, RiskOut's Vice President of Compliance and Operation, as well as Katie Farrell, the Vice President Senior Compliance Consultant for United Bankers Bank. Kristen has worked on both fraud and BSA teams, where she successfully created and implemented BSA monitoring programs at community financial institutions for varying higher risk industries like hemp, MSBs, ATMs, cannabis, and more. Last year, she was also selected as PBC's Compliance Person of the Year by a group of her peers. Katie has worked in or for financial institutions of various sizes and complexities for over 20 years and has served in management, compliance, audit, and operational roles throughout her career. She joined United Bankers Bank in May of 2022, where she provides consultation and compliance solution designed for community banks such as compliance audits, risk assessments, and system validations, policy, product, and education development, and virtual compliance support. We are so excited and honored to have them both joining us here today. And before we dive into today's agenda and content, Katie, would you mind telling us a little bit more about UBB's compliance services?
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's always fun and a pleasure to collaborate with RiskOut and the team. Like Ethan said, I've been with UBB Compliance Services since May of 2022. And we are a division of United Bankers Bank, a correspondent bank for many institutions across the country. We on the compliance services team provide pretty much anything that you need to assist you with your compliance management system. We serve community banks all over the country in 14 states. And the good thing about our team is we've all been in your shoes. We have about 80 years of collected experience between us as former compliance officers, BSA officers, examiners, you name it, we've probably done it. And like the slide here lets you know, the services that we offer include audits, reviews, etc. But if there's a need that you have, more than likely we can meet it. So thank you again for having me today.
Of course. Thank you so much, Katie. It is always a pleasure when we get to work together. Kristen, would you mind walking us through today's roadmap and what all we'll be covering on this webinar?
Oh, you know it, Ethan. Hi, Katie. Good to see you. Good to be here with you. I love working with Katie.
You too, Kristen.
Well, we are excited to be here because we, both with our own cheeks in the seats experience doing the job and then working with institutions all over the country now. I think we got a lot of insights that might be helpful for you guys. We're going to walk through the background just simplistically about what BSA is and the core of why it exists. We're going to look at some recent enforcement actions, talk through risk assessment, staffing and turnover, which is the elephant in the room a lot of times, training and education, and then we're going to go into a Q&A session so you guys can pick our brains accordingly. All right, I think it's always good to start at the basics, right? We need to really wash away all of the thoughts and burdens that most people put on BSA and really boil it down to what it is. Your job is to detect and report suspicious activity. You're there to help protect your financial institution against illicit activity, reputational risks, and to help protect the financial integrity of the United States. There are many components that go and feed into essentially achieving that, detecting and reporting of suspicious activity. And that all comes down to a couple of regulations. So the BSA and Patriot Act are the foundation regulations that lay out what we need to do in order, or what they believe we need to do in order to achieve a successful BSA program to detect and report illicit activity. So there's really 5 components of BSA. The 5 pillars of BSA is what you'll hear frequently referred to as. We talk through those. We talk about internal controls. We'll talk more about that, Katie, here in a second, about what you're seeing in institutions and what internal controls mean. You have to, as a BSA, to be compliant with BSA regulations, you have to have somebody at your institution who is a designated BSA officer. So when we say a designated BSA officer, we mean somebody who is responsible for the institution's adherence to complying with the BSA AML regulations that exist in the US. We'll go into more detail about that in a minute too. Periodic BSA training, meaning your staffing is getting trained on BSA, what their responsibilities are from the front line to the back line. Independent testing, is your program doing what it's saying? Is it adhering to BSA AML regulations? Are there gaps that you should consider? Independent testing isn't meant to be a gotcha thing. It's meant to help you identify areas of potential improvement to ensure that when your regulators come in, that you really are adhering to the rules and regulations of BSA. And then ongoing customer due diligence. This one is actually not formally recognized by the OCC, but it is one that they still take into consideration under the first 4 pillars. So ongoing customer due diligence means not only did you properly identify your customers at onboarding, but on a risk-based approach, you are updating information on your customers so you ensure that you know them not just time at onboarding, but on some type of ongoing cadence that you deem necessary to manage the risks at your institution. These are the backbones of BSA. This is where you are judged on when your regulators come in. Just put it frankly, you're judged on it. You are held up to these responsibilities, that you are really understanding the importance of each of these sections and how they apply to your institution. Katie, you want to elaborate on that any?
Sure, and just for the audience's sake, a lot of what I'll share today will be what we're actually seeing from community banks through reviews that we are performing. So I've got a lot of real world scenarios, and we're going to delve into all of these pillars, but some of my immediate thoughts when it comes to internal controls is the word thoughtful. Be very thoughtful about your internal controls, and we will get to that in depth. The designation of a BSA officer, that is an extremely hot topic right now through enforcement actions. Not just the designation of, but is that person qualified to carry out the duties and not wearing 20 other hats on top of that one. Training, I think for me, education is the most important pillar. It is ongoing, and it is not a one and done exercise. Independent testing, that's obviously where I come in every week with clients, and I think that the highlight there is making sure that you are seeking out a qualified independent party as well. And then ongoing due diligence seems to be one of the areas that is also highlighted by enforcement actions, and it oftentimes is a tough one for some of our clients to really wrap their arms around. But to me, it's very simple, and I think that's why I love working with Risk Out so much and with Kristen, is that we try to simplify all of this. It's the why behind it. Once you understand that and you grasp that, the rest of this all makes a lot more sense. So hopefully today, especially with CDD, if you can articulate that to your front line of why it's important and how it will aid BSA personnel in identifying that potential suspicious activity and potential illicit activities that Kristen noted earlier, the why is what is so very important.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about designating a BSA officer. So who is ultimately responsible for your BSA program? Well, it's the board of directors. They're ultimately responsible. They're the ones who are going to appoint a BSA officer who is responsible for the day-to-day actions of what's happening at that institution from a BSA compliance perspective. But ultimately, it feeds up to the board of directors. What's the problem with that a lot of times, guys? The problem is that your board of directors is usually glued together by a bunch of really, smart individuals who have worked at varying different organizations throughout their career, none of which are typically banks. So they don't really understand necessarily the depth of what BSA takes to run a successful program. A lot of times we get stuck in, and when we're talking about BSA, AML, and compliance, we're talking about being put into a bucket of being a cost center. Really we are revenue protectors, because the cost of non-compliance is much, much more expensive than the cost of compliance if you're doing it right out the door. But the problem is that the board of directors oftentimes, unless they are hearing, unless they are proactive about BSA, it's hard for them to understand really the importance of hiring a qualified individual to be the BSA officer. We're going to talk about staffing and turnover and all of that here in a few minutes, but I think it's important to realize that BSA officers just don't grow on trees. This is not a profession that people naturally fall into. I've got, a 15 and 19-year-old kid. Do they want to be BSA officers when they grow up? They don't know. No, they don't. That's not what my college kid is going to school for, right? It's, the unique individuals get in this space because it is a tough job every day. You're trying to protect your institution by looking for people doing bad things all day long, essentially, right? It can be wear on you. It's mentally wearing, and it takes a tenacity and a willingness not to be complacent in what you're looking for too. But these people are hard to find, and they're also sometimes expensive, and smaller institutions have a hard time hiring folks that are qualified. So what happens a lot of times, it's this teller that ends up drawing the short straw that's get designated the BSA officer. That is the wrong move for institutions who are really trying to protect their institution. Now, if you want to have a junior BSA person that you're training up to take place as contingency planning over the retirement, or as a backup to the BSA officer should something happen, that's great. But as the BSA officer, that should be taken very seriously as to who you're giving that job, and that's reflected in the recent enforcement actions that have happened this year. It is not to be taken lightly, that role. And as we are, I think, on our 20th enforcement action this year, if there's any evidence that you as a board of directors or key executives, if there's any of you guys on this call, need to assess who you've got on the line and understanding, say, and if you're a BSA junior professional who was the one that drew the short straw and you're on here trying to learn stuff, you have resources, and Katie and I that are there to kind of help, give you guidance and stuff, because we've been in that chair how do you think we got in this role? Probably, you know, to begin with. It was like, oh, someone has to do it, you do it. So I think it's really important to understand that, you know, it cannot be understated the importance of understanding the 5 pillars as a BSA professional, which and then being able to properly educate the board on why your role is so important at the institution. Katie?
Yeah, I think we all have our own story as to how we became a BSA officer or a compliance officer. You know, that's funny that you say that, because you're right. It's not usually a career path for most of us, but Kristen and I are both very passionate specifically about this area. Some of the things I'd like to note specifically for the designated BSA officer is ensuring that they are independent. Obviously, a person who is opening accounts and collecting CIP and CDD and beneficial ownership and screening for OFAC probably should not be the person that is performing compliance monitoring and ensuring that regulatory reporting is appropriate. We do see that sometimes where there is not much segregation of duties in this area, and it is so very important that that also is very thoughtfully considered. It's okay to wear multiple hats. I know that we are all stretched for resources, specifically in the human category. So we don't necessarily look down upon a BSA officer who also happens to be the CFO in a lot of cases, sometimes the bank president. It's not necessarily looked down upon, but you just want to make sure that that independence is very much fostered and that they feel confident and autonomous to report directly to the group of individuals who are ultimately responsible for the program, and that is the board. While it is okay for a BSA officer administratively to report to the CEO, for example, they really need a direct line to the board. That is who is responsible for the program, and so it's very important that that line is there, it's open, and the independence is very much in place, because your examiners are going to want to know that that BSA officer feels very empowered and very confident in sharing anything that needs to be shared with the board. Also, when performing client engagements, I never think there's ever such thing as too much sharing with the board, whether that's providing them with these 4 handouts that you'll get today in their next board packet, whether it is doing an in-person training or giving them UBB's compliance newsletter that we publish monthly. However you facilitate that information, it doesn't have to be a 1-hour one-on-one presentation, but share as much information as you can with your board, because like Kristen mentioned, their priorities outside of serving on a board of a bank entail much more than BSA. So as long as they have that information at their fingertips and you are proactive in sharing as much as you can, then they can never fault the BSA officer for not trying to educate them on what's going on in the industry, and what enforcement actions are occurring and what needs some attention within the organization.
Yeah, and one quick thing to add is just also documenting that you have provided those documents to them when you did it. In our world, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. If you want to cover yourself as a BSA officer, as somebody who's trying to educate the board, document the conversations you're having, keep track of those things. It's important for your own coverage.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That does bring us to our first poll question, which you should see coming up on your screen now. We would love for everyone to go ahead and respond to this question. It asks, how long have you been on the BSA team at your current financial institution? We've got options ranging all the way from less than a year, all the way up to over 10 years. We would love to just get a better understanding of who all we have on this call, so we can know just how deep we want to dive or where we should keep it a little bit higher level, depending on the tenure of the folks here. Excellent. Y'all are quick on the draw this afternoon. Thank you so much for those quick responses. We'll go ahead and share these results out. As you can see here, a full quarter of our audience has been on the BSA team at their current financial institution for less than a year. Another just over a quarter is between 1 and 3 years, so still a pretty green group we have. The other two largest options are from 5 to 10 or over 10 years. So it seems like we've got a lot of folks at either end of that spectrum there. Katie, I know you work with banks every single day. How does this stack up to what you were expecting?
It actually mirrors what we are seeing. It seems like lately we are encountering very green, very new staff. And then of course we have some seasoned professionals that have been in their role for some time, but they are anxiously approaching retirement in some cases, and they are wanting to ensure that the program remains successful. So it looks like we have a wide variety of those in the audience today. So we will try to dig a little deeper, but still keep it a little high level. But that is definitely what we're seeing, and we'll get into, as Kristen stated earlier, turnover and continuity of a program if the BSA officer is to depart for any reason.
Yeah. Let's talk about the role of a BSA officer. So we've touched a little bit on this already, but let's remember the fact that as somebody who is responsible for running a BSA program, know that that comes with personal liability for ensuring that your institution is adhering to BSA. So that means that if I had $1 for every time I heard a BSA officer say, I don't want to do that, I'm going to end up in an orange jumpsuit, I'd be so rich. Because if you really understand what that means, or at least have heard that on the high level, you immediately think, if anything's wrong with my program, I'm going to go straight to jail. So that's where we get tagged with that. I'm really risk averse. I'm the no department, because I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to do things that are harder. Well, I challenge you to think through that, because it's not your job to have a perfect program. It's your job to design a reasonable and achievable program. There are ways to mitigate risks without over-engineering something that you just cannot yourself adhere to or keep up to. Your job, again, is to detect and report suspicious activity. You can do that reasonably through an achievable program by thinking through and understanding what's the risks to my institution based on the products, services, and demographics we're serving. And once you back up from there, and you're going to want to, really understand that, and you're probably going to do that if you're doing a risk assessment correctly, you're probably going to learn that through the risk assessment, what your risks are. Then you back up from there and you say, how can I reasonably achieve and mitigate those risks for my institution? If you have somebody that you found a bad guy or a customer that has come up and bubbled up through the cracks that you were like, oh, how did I miss that? That's okay. That's a learning lesson. It means you designed a reasonable and achievable program, because you didn't catch everything, but your program was well designed enough to catch something, even if it was after the fact, And so I think it's important to realize is that you don't have to be a no machine. You can be a yes if machine if you have the right education, the right understanding of the risks to your institution, and understand that even if you didn't check one box, you're not going to jail. Ultimately, it's your board of directors that's in trouble. If you're egregiously ignoring your duties, that's different. Willful blindness is different. That's when you end up in an orange jumpsuit. But don't stress yourself to death over thinking you're going to land there, when really, as long as you are showing the efforts you're making to mitigate the known risks at your institution, and you are writing that in a board-approved policy and through your procedures, then if your program is really adhering to the policies that you have written and the board has agreed upon, then you are doing your job that you were supposed to be doing, and you will likely never end up in an orange jumpsuit, right, Katie?
Yes, hopefully not. I completely agree that it's okay to raise your hand. It's okay to self-identify deficiencies. It sounds kind of weird, but one of my most favorite things is when a client calls and says, Katie, I think we've messed up. I need to fix it. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. Let's work out a game plan. Identifying your deficiencies and your weaknesses is not a bad thing. It's really part of your job as a BSA officer. And our customers and our markets and our products and our systems change, or they should if we're growing and we are aligning ourselves with our strategy. And that's okay. That's just when you sit back down, and we'll get to risk assessments in a moment. And I'm a huge risk assessment nerd, but really sitting down, and again, I keep using the word thoughtful, but thoughtfully walking through the risk assessment and understanding where your risks are and what your controls are. And I'll just give a quick example of, we get questions all the time. Should I file a SAR or shouldn't I? And the answer is always the same. A, I can't tell you whether or not to file a SAR as an independent third party. But B, as long as you document your reasoning and it's appropriate, you're not going to get dinged by a regulator or by an auditor. Our job is to evaluate the controls and your processes for making the decision whether or not to file a SAR, not whether or not you should have filed a SAR. So as long as you're able to document reasonably and appropriately how you arose at a decision around a specific customer or activity, you should be just fine. We call them defensive SARs. Sometimes we file SARs just for the sake of we don't want to get in trouble, when in reality it's not truly maybe a financial crime or illicit activity or a trend or a scam or fraud that is rampant in the industry. But we are filing the SARs just because we don't want to get in trouble for not filing it. So I caution you to just be thoughtful and be consistent through all your processes. I'm using SARs, suspicious activity reporting, as an example, but being consistent with your decisions is really what's key here.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about common pitfalls. So we know that there's been 18 enforcement actions. When this was written, there's actually 20 plus at this point. And they range all over the place. Ethan, you want to go to the next slide? We see that in the year 2024, there have been more enforcement actions in the beginning of the year, the first 6 months of the year, than there were in most other previous years. A lot of them are issued around BSA AML. That's what we're focused on here. That's what you see in this graph. So you're seeing how folks are getting in trouble because they have somebody who maybe they even designated as a BSA officer, but never told them they were the BSA officer. And so they have programs that are not compliant because they didn't even know. And then we see some that, you know, are just pillar violations. That's what you're going to get written up on. A lot of banking as a service. We'll talk more about that here in a second. Issues. People not understanding that the fact that if they're a sponsor bank or a fintech that is running transactions on their behalf, that institution is ultimately responsible for those transactions and the BSA AML responsibilities for detecting and reporting suspicious activity there. Ethan, next one. So again, we said, you know, banking as a service is such a common issue. We saw a big bank, 5-star bank yesterday, closing down their banking as a service division. There are definitely needs in this area to serve that part of the industry because they can move quicker, they're more nimble. But you know, these sponsor or these fintechs wishing to be sponsored, they can move quicker than a bank can. They can offer services and products that a bank can't just move on quickly. So I think they're very important to the economic stability and reaching demographics that we couldn't normally. You got to ultimately think through, it's not just on paper. If they say that they're going to have the AML resources to get through the responsibilities they have in that place, so they better prove it. And you better make them prove it because you're ultimately responsible for ensuring that they're adhering to that. Budget constraints in this should, you know, again, remember maybe the BSA officers wearing 17 other hats and they're just the BSA officers. Well, that's just not on their brain. So budget constraints prevents them from having proper staffing or proper tools to mitigate risks. Goes into the legacy and outdated system, and there being communication gaps from from the BSA officer having the ability to speak to the board and or key executives on the risks that they're seeing. Just not having that direct line, again, is really important.
Yeah, and I'll add to that one of the things that has really caught my attention with enforcement actions, and not just published enforcement actions, but as part of our AML CFT reviews, we do take a look at the client's last exam report, and the recommendations within are much more prevalent than what I've seen in the past, and if I'm being honest, are quite nitpicky. And in this case, just to give you a little flavor, we service clients anywhere from less than 100 million in assets to approximately 3 billion in assets, and all in between. And we are finding that these actions are not specific to any one size, not specific to any one institution that offers certain products and services. Yes, banking as a service has been one of the ones that has been hit the heaviest, it seems like. But it's been very surprising to me that size really doesn't matter when it comes to the 5 pillars and what's expected of all banks, not just the really large ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, that does bring us to our next poll question. Since we are talking about enforcement actions, we wanted to hear from y'all on the call on how you're responding to them. What are you going to do about them? Have you already implemented any changes in your program? So we would love to hear from y'all. Are you reevaluating your BSA program based on recent enforcement action trends? You guys can go ahead and give us your responses. Everything from yes, we've already done it, no, but we do know we need to, maybe not yet because we don't know where to start, or you know what, no, we're not planning to make those changes. We might just have to wait and see what happens down the road. Give y'all just a couple more seconds to get these responses in. Alrighty, looks like we got a pretty even split here. This will be interesting. So as I turn these results around and you can see them, you can see that we're pretty evenly spread across the line. 22% of our audience says yes, they've already updated their programs. 27, which is the second largest option here, says no, but they do know that they need to. 20%, not quite yet, because they just don't know where to start. And the largest section says no, we are not going to reevaluate our BSA program, and we do not plan to. Kristen, let me ask you, are you surprised by this?
I would like to talk to you 30% personally on the side and understand what it is that you don't think you need to reevaluate. It's always good. It doesn't matter if you've had the best exams in the past, and you're on to 18-month review cycles. We are talking to institutions. We participated in the ICBA Think Tech Accelerator this summer, RiskOut did. And we talked to well over 100 banks. More than half had gone through their exam and said it looked wildly different than it has ever, that they had had flying colors in the past and it's not the same. So I would just do a little soul search, and I would say, it's okay to go in there and say, challenge yourself with questions, or have a third party come in and say, it's not picking apart your program to be ugly to you or mean to you or question what your philosophies are or what you've been doing historically. It's saying, based on the risks that are out there today that may have changed in the last year and what the enforcement actions have said, it's really good practice just to do some self-reflection. So just some food for thought. Oh, the elephant in the room, staffing. Staffing is such a challenge for institutions. We work with institutions who either have pillars that are BSA officers that have been in the chair for 45 plus years, or we are working with institutions who people who are just green, ready to get in this world, eager, have done their, have their ATM certification and whatnot, feel good about that, but are still not seasoned in the day-to-day things that can arise and challenges from that. Because of that, the retirement, we are also seeing that folks that had one person shop with a BSA officer who ran the whole thing and did everything, on spreadsheets or in their head or whatever, it's not repeatable for the next person that comes in the office. So then you're having to hire 2 or 3 people to try to cover for that job because there's not really proper contingency planning that happened or the right tools in place to help with that contingency planning. You can have stuff written down all day long, but if you don't have things in a well-organized way where people can access it and know where to pick up the next day, then you're running into an issue where you're setting your next succession plan. Your BSA officer that's coming in is set up for, frankly, a really hard time, if not failure, from that perspective.
Yeah, I can absolutely attest that not having some form of plan in place can be very, very difficult. We get calls all the time from bank management. Their BSA officer is either leaving abruptly or planned, and literally no one else in the institution has any clue what that individual did on a daily basis, much less where to go to download the 314A report every other week, or where to go to the BSA e-filing website to file CTRs or SARs. And while we very much appreciate their cry for help, I really wish that there would have been more of a plan in place prior to the departure of the BSA officer, because like Kristen said, some of the elements of the program aren't day-to-day. Obviously, you don't do a risk assessment every single day or update your policy every day, but some things are very time sensitive, like CTRs and 314A, and someone else within your organization needs to at least have a general understanding of what needs to happen the very next day if your BSA officer or personnel were to depart. I can also attest that, speaking of examination reports, back in my prior life, when I was working in financial institutions, usually the strategic plan or the business continuity planning often did not include the BSA department. It was more for what was considered an essential role, such as the CEO, the CFO, etc. And we are seeing in exam reports where examiners are highlighting that there needs to be not just a verbal plan, but a written plan in place to continue out the program in the event BSA personnel leave. And it's a very small phrase in the FFIEC's manual, but the board is responsible, and I'm not quoting because I don't know if I'm going to get it exact, but they are responsible for fostering program continuity in the event there's a change in employee composition. It's a very small phrase within the manual, but the examiners are honing in on it. So the board needs to be very much made aware that they are responsible for ensuring the continuity of the program if a change occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're gonna touch on this just briefly so we can spend a little bit of time on the risk assessment component of everything. Staff augmentation is a great tool to have, but vet who you are having do your staff augmentation. In your checklist of what you're looking for, use this slide to look for, what their experience is, how they keep people up to date on training, and so on and so forth from that perspective, because there are so many folks that say, yeah, absolutely, we can fill in for you. And then trust me, they're duds, because I have been in roles where we've had to augment staff because we're migrating another institution over or merging with another institution, and some of them are just, bless their hearts, they try, but they just don't have it. And you either have it in this world or you don't. When it comes to BSA, you got to make sure you've got the right people there. And it's okay if you bring somebody in and you think on the surface was good and then they stink and you have to let them go. That happens. You got to protect yourself and your institution. Ethan?
All right, that brings us to our next poll question as we get into risk assessments. Y'all should see this popping up on your screen as well. This is just going to ask a quick question about a BSA automation and if you have any systems in place currently. Those options range from everything from no, we don't use a BSA automation system, we are currently fully manual, or yes, it does, we do have one, it works great. maybe you have one and it only automates part of your system, maybe just, EDD, CDD, or just transaction monitoring, just SAR, CTR filing. Or finally, maybe you have one in place, but it's just not cutting it. It's just not doing what it's supposed to do or operating as effectively as you expected. Give y'all just a couple more seconds to get your answers in here. All righty, excellent. I'll share these results out. This one is a little bit more lopsided than we saw our first one. 42% of our audience on the call today says, no, we are manual. We are not using a BSA automation system. We have a quarter of our audience that is using one, and they say it works great, which is so great to hear. 32% says, yes, they are automating, but only automating a small portion. And only 1%, which we're very happy to hear, is using an automation system that they are not happy with. Kristen, I know you've worked with a number of automation systems in your tenure. Does this surprise you at all?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that I see so many folks on manual. There are so many institutions that feel like they can't afford software or feel like it's just going to be it's going to cause them more work than what they've done historically, so they're not ready, or maybe they're just smaller, they have one branch, it's not worth it for them. That doesn't surprise me. It does also not surprise me that folks are like, I have it, but I'm not happy with it, because there are honestly legacy systems that exist out there that were created a long time ago, and risks were very different. They're not flexible, they're hard to deal with, so on and so forth. So I mean, I can see where there's quite the mixed opinion out there. We all have things we love about certain systems and other things we don't. So, it's good to see that some folks are getting out there and at least, attempting to use some software. Because if you have the right software in your pocket, it's going to help you do your job better and more efficiently, more effectively than it is to try to continue to do things manually, where, again, that affects your contingency planning and yada, yada, yada from there. So. All right, let's talk about risk assessments real quick, Katie. We could probably do a whole nother webinar, and we should discuss that offline on risk assessments. But remember that risk assessments are not a one-size-fits-all. You are going to need to, we have a BSA risk assessment you can download on our website, but it's not going to be everything essentially that you need to cover. Or maybe it's going to be too much because we tried to encompass everything in there. Tailor whatever risk assessment template you're using down to whatever the risks are that you should be considering for your institution. Katie probably has some stuff to add there from regards to what she sees and helps people with risk assessment. But I also want to always make clear that Appendix J in this FFIEC manual here, this is one of the last ones they printed. It's not a risk assessment, guys. It says risk assessment matrix. It's not a risk assessment. Good way to get started in understanding high level risk. Don't be tricked into thinking that's a risk assessment. That's a trap. I mean, they didn't set it, but they accidentally named it. Terrible name for it, that particular section. Katie?
Yeah, I see that often, the cut and paste of the risk matrix from the FFIEC manual. Here's my risk assessment. I will say that when I'm in an auditor role, the risk assessment is the roadmap for where we're going to dig deep and where we're going to say, I think they've got some pretty good controls in this area. May not want to dig so deep there. The risk assessment is the first thing, or it should be, the examiner picks up and essentially defines their roadmap for your exam. And the only way that they can do that effectively is if you provide enough information through that assessment for them to determine what areas are higher risk and those that are not. And to me, the only way that you can do that is through quantitative data, numbers, black and white statistics through your risk assessment, so that you can, over time, and explain to your board, track in the direction of risk in any area. For example, if 3 years ago you had 13 high-risk customers on your list, and then this year you have 50, you better be able to explain that and what controls you have put into place to mitigate the heightened risk in that area. So risk assessments are so very important. They are the foundation, so to speak, that you pour in order to build the rest of your BSA house and the controls that you put into place. So I can't stress enough the word thoughtfulness here, and sitting down, taking the time. And I also want to say too that risk assessments aren't just the BSA officer's job. Every area pretty much in the bank impacts this program. It needs to be a collective effort. It needs to be the right parties sitting around the table, really discussing and hashing out some of these areas, operations, marketing, lending, you name it, HR even. Employees also can commit potentially suspicious activities as well. If you really think about it, all business lines are impacted or play a part in this program and the controls that you put into place. So take the time. Don't just check the box so that you can get it to your board the next meeting. And please, if your risk is low, medium, or high, be able to explain it through your data and through your content within the document.
Absolutely. Some other things I want you guys to, take away from this and look through. We took these slides and we made even more detailed slides for you on your handout, so you actually have kind of a guide to walk through some of these slides a little bit deeper. A lot of times we're looking at the numerical transactional risk, which is so important, what Katie said, but other things to consider is looking at reputational risk, strategic risk, and vendor risk. You're ultimately wanting to ask yourself, do our internal controls provide us with sufficient insight into our people, process, and systems actually mitigating risks effectively? This should be a working document too. It should, it shouldn't be just a, oh snap, my examiners are coming in 6 weeks and I haven't done this and I rushed through it. No, triage it, treat it. It's so painful to get through sometimes, but there's no better story that's been told about the risks at your institution than by the results of your risk assessment.
Yeah, and I'll add to that also, if you are relying on any vendors or third parties to collect CIP, CDD, etc. on your behalf, and the one that comes to mind immediately is an indirect lending program, please don't tell your examiner, oh, we just rely on them for that, and not have a real understanding of how they are ensuring that they meet your internal controls as well as the regulatory requirements as well. So anytime you are going to outsource and banking as a service and fintechs, also, if you're relying on someone else to meet the requirements of your program, it's ultimately still your responsibility.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, I think it's going to be good for you guys if you guys sign up for Katie or the UBB's compliance newsletter that comes out every month. She's got a really good article coming out on these proposed rule changes that are going into effect throughout the next year. There's not a whole lot of like fundamental changes. It's just things are getting more serious, right? They're like, instead of these kind of broad things that we're looking for that were suggestive, it's going to be more of a deeper dive into the risks of how you are mitigating the risks at your institution, regulatory reporting, and so on and so forth. She's got some great content coming out on that in the next month's UBB compliance newsletter. So I really, really encourage you to sign up for that so you can take a deeper dive into that. And we plan on at Risk Out doing a little bit of a session on this as well in a deeper dive towards the end of the year, so you guys can be set and ready, around November to kind of think through what you should be prioritizing for the first of the year.
Yeah, and if that's your first time hearing about that proposal, please Google it after after this, because if the proposed rule does become final, it will be effective January the 3rd, which is right around the corner. So if you haven't heard of it, please take a look.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We know that education is so necessary in this space. It's hard to find good education. That's been a priority since I have came to Risk Out 4 years ago. I was like, by God, if we don't do anything else, we're going to give some free education that's actually useful, because I needed it so bad when I was a a BSA officer, practical things, not just high level things. So, just keep yourself informed, sign up for different agencies out there. There's different UBB's tools and all that allow you to get the education that you need to really stay abreast of what's going on trend wise, because you may not think it's happening at your institution because maybe you're in a smaller rural town somewhere that there's no way that's happening in my backyard. Yeah, it is. Sneak up on you. Trust me, I've been there before. So just make sure you are investing in well vetted partnerships and education that you're reaching out there for. Your examiners are going to ask for proof of ongoing education. So document every time, like document today's webinar and keep the contents of it somewhere so they can see that you're trying to stay, on top of what's changing in the industry, what risks you should be considering, and so on and so forth there.
Yeah, I think that was one of the main takeaways I had from Vincent's proposal, is that even though the national priorities that they identify, which include, the ones that we know about, cybercrime, trafficking, etc., even though you may not think they impact your institution, it's going to be expected that you have at least considered what's going on out there as part of your program. So claiming that you don't know what's going on, it could get you in trouble.
Yeah, for sure. This is how we stay plugged in, just so you guys know. We attend conferences, and that's not doable for everybody. But if it's, you have some local chapters, sometimes it's ACAMS chapters, and those that will throw local events to you that are free or low cost. I encourage you to attend those. Just continue to sign up for our webinars. We always try to hold one at least monthly, so you guys are on relevant hot topics. Regulatory updates, whoever your agency is, or all regulatory agencies, sign up for those alerts that come out in regards to memo guidance or enforcement actions. Certificates that are relevant to you. There are some that are, harder to maintain. ACAMS can get expensive to maintain if, all the requirements of ongoing education, but there are other affordable ways to keep abreast of and obtain certificates that are relevant to what you are trying to achieve. And then peer-to-peer sharing, build a community, help, stay engaged with each other. And, we have our own community within here at Risk Out where we have folks that feed off of each other, and because we can't do this job alone, it's hard. It's hard, and that can't be understated. So I think it's important to just acknowledge that and say, let's share with each other. And we don't have to share we can't share who we're filing SARs on, but we can say, this is what we're seeing, or how have you addressed this at your institution, or do you use this core, or what data do you get from here? And, you start to see where that collaboration really pays off.
I could not agree more. When so I was in operational retail roles the first half of my career, and then I moved over into the compliance space. And what I noticed immediately, and what I really capitalized on and continue to do so, and it's really how Kristen and I became friends virtually in this world, is that we are all in this together. And in the compliance space, reaching out to anyone, I assure you they're going to reach back and they're going to help and share their story, because at the end of the day, it is our responsibility as financial institutions and as individuals to fight all of these terrible crimes that are occurring in our country financially through our institutions. And so don't ever hesitate to reach out to your peers or to Kristen or to me. I promise you that we're here to help, because we've either asked the question before or we're going to have the question tomorrow.
Well,
excellent. Well, thank you for that. Now, before we do have some Q&A that we'll dive into here, so I highly encourage you, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel there. But now, before we do get there, I do want to reiterate just how excited we are to partner with UBB to share RiskOut's brand new BSA AML solution. This platform has been crafted not only by former BSA officers like Kristen, who we have here today, but also by the incredible BSA officers that we work with every single day to ensure community banks and credit unions have the tools that they need to catch those bad actors, not just efficiently, but effectively. If you would like to learn how this solution can benefit your own BSA program, we're going to go ahead and throw one final poll up on the screen. And if you're just lucky enough and you asked for a demo, you might be fortunate enough to have it led by Kristen Parker herself, if she is feeling so kind there. So we'll give y'all just a couple more seconds to go ahead and respond to that poll question, which you should see on the screen there. You can select as many or as few as those options as you'd like. But in the meantime, I do encourage y'all to ask any of those questions that you have in the question box. We've already had a couple come through. Katie, Kristen, do y'all have a couple minutes where we can throw some of these questions your way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we had one came in while we were talking about some of those enforcement actions, and that was asking about, you mentioned that some of the exams looked very different recently. Could y'all take a second and kind of elaborate on what exactly you mean and what that looks like?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can you take that one? Yes. So as far as recommendations within examination reports that aren't necessarily enforcement actions, we are seeing a good bit around software and the mismanagement of it, or it being wide open and everybody kind of has their hands in it. So we have had some clients who have had to get an external validation, and in some cases they're switching software altogether. But I will stress that software is a tool. It is not your program. So it's kind of like going to the gym. If you miss a day and then miss another day and then miss another day, before you know it, you're not in shape anymore. And it's the same with the software. So we're seeing a lot of software mismanagement, some instances about customer due diligence, and there not being a defined process there, not a defined process for reviewing high-risk customers, etc. And then as far as the enforcement actions, which are the published actions by the regulators that we all get to see, and that could impact your reputational risk. OCC published theirs today. Mostly it has to do with qualified BSA personnel and governance, or lack thereof, meaning the board is not carrying out their fiduciary responsibility to oversee the program and really understand what is going on. And just a little plug here for our newsletter from UBB. It is complimentary. All you have to do is subscribe, and we track all the enforcement actions from the previous month so that you have them there in a one-stop shop. Because like Kristen mentioned earlier, enforcement actions are the way to learn from others' mistakes and to really understand what the regulators are honing in on. So
that's great. Thank you so much. That answered one of our other questions that came in of how can I keep up with all the latest enforcement actions? So great tip there. Go ahead and subscribe to that UBB newsletter. Great source for some good resources there. We had another question coming that's looking for just a little bit of additional information about this proposed update that should take effect on January 3rd. Katie, I know you're kind of the expert on that front. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. Yeah, so the AML Act of 2020, as part of that, FinCEN was to essentially put together this proposal to modernize, and I use that word in quotations, BSA programs. Like Kristen said, there's no real monumental changes that are part of that proposal. It will make risk assessments concrete. Believe it or not, they've been more of a best practice or a supervisory expectation to this point. Like she mentioned, we do have an article that's being published in our next newsletter that we will release on October 1st that outlines the major components of that proposal. Essentially, risk-based, risk-based, risk-based is throughout that proposal, and I can't stress that enough in learning more about that. But it is, if finalized, will be final on January 3rd. So not a whole lot of time between now and then.
Thank you for that, Katie. That is very helpful. And thank you to all of those that did ask questions. That is all of the time that we have for today to answer those questions live on this session. But y'all know us. You are easy. It's easy to get in touch with us. We'd love to answer any questions that you may have after this session, 2 months from now, 2 years from now, you name it. We are here to help you out. I do also want to extend a huge thank you to both Kristen and Katie for taking their time and sharing their expertise with us. It means the world. We thank you so much for coming here and presenting. There will be a brief survey following today's webinar where you can provide us with a little bit of feedback on today's session, what you'd like to see in the future, and even requests for future topics. Please take a moment and share your thoughts there. We'd love any feedback or comments that we can get. And of course, if you want to learn more about RiskOut or the United Bankers Bank, you can come, stop by, say hi at riskout.com or visit UBB's website. We hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.